Hello BionicDance, hello YouTube. BionicDance, you bring up the question of free will. To me, this is a very interesting and fascinating one. I do not claim to have a solution to the problem or the one answer. Um, Actually, I'm pretty sure that nobody has this answer really. Um, I will, however, offer a few thoughts of mine on the subject that proved helpful to me, so maybe they are useful to you. Every atheist faces this question, I think, at some point. Don't you sometimes think it would be so much easier to be a theist? God gave us free will, therefore we have it. Sadly, my mind doesn't work that way. Let me first deal with quantum mechanics. Yes, I know. It may or may not turn out that quantum mechanics can finally tell us whether the universe is ultimately deterministic or not. But I have a very strict and firm rule that I follow religiously, which is that everybody who uses quantum mechanics to argue any point outside of physics and anyone who tries to argue from quantum mechanics and cannot show me at least a master's degree and some peer-reviewed publications in this field is most probably talking right out of their ass. It's a subject that I don't claim to understand. It's a subject that probably 5 to 10 people on this whole planet really do understand, and we should not use it in our arguments, period. So, if we do not use quantum mechanics, then it seems the universe is deterministic. So, the question arises, can there be free will in a deterministic universe? If you understand free will as uh, being able to commit actions that cannot be predetermined from the outside, we could probably imagine a machine that is capable of knowing everything to in the cosmos to a degree that might allow this machine to predetermine your actions. If we do this at an absolute level, then this would have to be a machine that is larger than the universe itself, i.e. God. So we can basically exclude that. And even if God existed, he doesn't seem to really tell us much about the free will of others. We might, on a much lower scale, imagine a machine that doesn't know everything but knows enough to predict your actions. And that might actually become an issue at some point. If we reach that point, then we have to really rethink our notions about what a person is, what an individual is, what free will is. However, we are not there yet. Um, so what's left is really speculation in some way or form, and using our observations as much as possible. Now, it is often said that in a deterministic universe, applying the rules of reductionism, free will is impossible because everything is determined by some cause. And this may actually be true. However, I think that there is a huge misunderstanding going around about reductionism and substance. Reductionism just says use as little concepts as possible. Use only the concepts that you really need for your theory. Now, in a purely biological sense, it makes sense to say that there is no person in this room. And you could argue that my personality, my free will, my individuality is an illusion created by my brain. However, this free will illusion, this personality thing, is an emergent property. And I do not think that emergent properties are necessarily illusions. That we can say that they do not exist. Okay? Um, it makes sense in a certain context, for example, to talk about culture. But culture is not a thing that exists. It's not an entity that you can, that has breadth and width and height. Uh, it's purely a concept that we use in sociology and religion and psychology and whatever to explain things. And since we do not have a world formula, it is okay and necessary to use different concepts in different areas, uh, even if those concepts are not always derived from a purely materialistic worldview. We simply cannot do without it currently, and probably never will. I don't know. Maybe our brains are just not capable of handling a worldview that is so vast and so closed and so consistent. So, if it makes sense to talk about a culture, for example, it might make sense to talk about free will. I think the problem becomes even more obvious when you realize that all concepts are in some way made up. And the question of is something real does not necessarily reduce to the question, does it have substance? Does it have its own substance? For example, if you picture a tree and if you then take the seed of that tree, and if you ask yourself the question, um, is that seed a tree? You may probably say no. But then if you ask yourself the question, at what point does the seed actually become a tree? You cannot really, you don't really have a good answer for that. There is no one point at which you can say, oh, now it's a tree. And before that, it was just a seed. So that goes to show that every concept you have is made up. It's just the best way to explain things in a certain context. And I would argue that in many, many contexts, free will is the best way to explain certain phenomena. Specifically, in the context of sociology, in the context of jurisprudence, which is very, very important. We cannot have a judicial system, a justice system, without assuming free will, whether it's there or not. And on a purely subjective, psychological level, I think it's obvious that the illusion of free will and of being a separate personality is, well, somewhat persistent. There may be people who, by extended meditation, can look through the illusion. But everything I read about neurology recently convinced me that perhaps there are one in 10 generations, once every 10 generations, a person comes about who can actually do that because their brain chemistry is different. And maybe that's what we call a Buddha. But I certainly can't. I'm pretty sure you can't. I'm pretty sure nobody I know can do that. So it makes sense to go about daily business as if free will existed as a separate entity, even if it doesn't. And it makes sense to have free will as a concept to explain things that happen in the world, even if this free will is not a separate entity. Because that's ultimately, I suspect, what we're talking about here. We're talking about free will as a separate entity. And if you really think it through, then as a materialist, I suppose, as an atheist, I just suppose that you're also a materialist. Not sure if you self-define as that. If not, then I'm wrong. But actually, even if you're a dualist, you have the same problem. Blah. Anyway, from a materialist point of view, there is ultimately only one substance. There are no things. There are no stars. There are no galaxies. There are no planets. There is no glass. Okay, there is no spoon. All of those are just useful concepts, useful theories that we apply. So, what's the difference between that and free will? I think the only real difference is that uh, free will is a concept that we have gotten so used to uh, because of Christianity, because of our culture, whatever, that thinking that it might not be real in the sense that it might not be a separate substance uh, is kind of hurtful, kind of uncanny, uncomfortable. But I don't think that there is anything to lose. You will always have this subjective experience of free will as long as you don't experience some severe neurological trauma. Um, you will always have this feeling that you are acting out of your free will. When you do some meditation, you may find out that your thoughts seem to arise spontaneously out of nothing. So you cannot determine where your decisions come from. You just don't know ultimately. So, in what sense do you actually have free will? You have free will uh, in the sense of this subjective experience of free will, uh, in the sense that you are coherent with your own thoughts, that your thought processes somehow seem to come up with this feeling. But actually, I think deep down on a subjective level, free will is little more than a vague feeling of self determination. And regardless of whether this is a separate entity or not, it's just there. Yeah. And I think it's pretty much obviously part of human, of the genetic makeup of humans. I don't know about that cat Baudelaire back there, but probably to them as well. I don't know. Yeah, so that's it. It's gotten longer than I planned. I have work to do, so goodbye.